What's going on, everyone? My name is Ty, and I'm here with the Lab 560 class, and I'm gonna be doing an interview with my friend Luis here. What's going on, man? How you doing?
Everything's good. Everything's good. How you doing?
I'm doing freaking great, man. I'm doing great. We've been in this class for 9 weeks now, and we've gone through a lot of stuff with discovering the capabilities of AI, discovering types of things that you can do with it that one person just wouldn't like. We were talking about our archetypes, like people that aren't really avid users of AI wouldn't expect us to do these kinds of things. And I know that you also have like a very interesting perspective on AI, and I was wondering if you could like elaborate on that a little bit.
What you mean on very interesting perspective? What's what kind of answer you're looking at from me?
So I just want to hear everything. Like I remember there was that one analogy you were talking about with I think it might have been like a castle or some.
Yeah, we can build up on that, but my my biggest concern with AI, not even concern, but interest, is how very deeply conceptual of a actual subject it can be. Sadly enough, and how most people treated it, they treated it in a very practical term. Let's take Anthropic, for example. Anthropic whole focus of research is getting practical results and seeing how things develop and just taking notes on that and building upon that. But they don't concern themselves too much on what theory it can build behind that. They've stated it all over the place that their theoretical standpoints are very much irrelevant just because you cannot control this kind of thing. It's very volatile. It just builds upon its own.
Right.
And we can see it every day how a lot of this technologies just boom out of a sudden. New things come up and you wouldn't even expect what you cannot even predict what's going to happen next.
Exactly. No, I agree. It's absolutely crazy. Like, you take a look at Anthropic's 2.0 model, right? And we had that presentation that we did. I don't know if you were a part of our group or not, but between the models 2.0 and 2.1, they're able to process now, I think it's about 100 times more tokens than they were originally able to process. And for those of you who are listening, a token is sort of a character or a word or a letter that a computer can break down and use to format data, summarize larger pieces of text. Super, super interesting stuff. But with the way that Anthropic and a bunch of other AIs have been developing, I want to know what your opinion is on, like, what you were talking about, how we're not going to be able to predict where AI is going because of how exponentially, how quickly it's advancing. So when you say you're not that excited for that, what's the worst outcome for you? Like for you personally, what's the worst outcome of that AI could take that would just completely wreck us? Like that's my question.
Practically speaking, thinking of what kind of product you can make out of AI is pretty much senseless just because of what we're talking. It builds upon itself exponentially. The more data you give, the more it'll learn and the more it can do. But that's beside the point because most of the things you can actually discover out of it are pretty much incidental. What I think would be our most important bit of research that we should do is think about it as how we interact with it. What's our consequences for us in a more cultural scope, in a more societal scope?
Like
Because
an ethical way.
just and maybe this is a little outdated, perhaps a little anachronic, but just looking back in the Industrial Revolution, one of our key texts or one of our key authors in understanding the Industrial Revolution, of course, Karl Marx, kind of entailed how a lot of technologies would alter the behavior of societies. And in itself, a machine, let's just deconstruct a machine from its very Marxist term. And although there is certain fallacies built upon Marx as an extension of Hegelian theory, you can actually take some very raw points that are very that help us guide our understanding. In itself, how Marx described the Industrial Revolution in terms of the machinery is that it not only facilitated work, because of course with a machine you can get more work done,
Right.
but the part of the work itself is not completely owned to you, right?
Yeah.
You're employed out of a certain hours, and that's the thing that you're getting paid at, to work for a certain hours. But the product itself is not an extension of those hours, but it's more the time in which that product changes into another product, right?
Yeah.
That's what that change, that added value is what Marx denominated as plus value. Any sort of machine creates more plus value, but does not necessarily entail more money, more
Right.
production. It entails more. It doesn't entail more production. It entails that things get more added value as it is done more effectively.
And as we see, like, more and more machines getting smarter and smarter, a lot of people are afraid of losing their jobs because there are machines that can not get tired, that don't run out of energy. It's just gonna end up, you're gonna be having, I want to say, I wouldn't be surprised if over half our population in a decade were computer scientists because of the way that machine learning and, all these different phenomena of AI and the general sense of the term in itself is getting to.
Marx described that relationship too, and let's take, for example, the Ford conveyor belt. Before the conveyor belt was institutionalized or even implemented somewhere, it was one single worker that had to do the full process, and that took a lot more time than dividing the work into little stages, very machinary in that sense. And just the inclusion of machines made that a lot of the works were more systematically, and by making works more systematically, you can employ a larger amount of workforce and more
And
flexible.
there's more order.
More flexible too in that sense. That's why in the very high stage of the Industrial Revolution, you saw a lot of child labor and whatnot. That is still to some extent extends to right now. By the ever growth of machine, you can also study that as an extension in the sense that it requires less practical knowledge in that sense to get certain works done, and it requires a different set of skills to get that work done. So when you're talking about an AI that's capable of doing a lot of things, that gives a lot of access to more society to perform certain tasks, but that doesn't mean it entails a higher quality of tasks.
In terms of like quality of making a product, right? You can of course get as good as you can with a machine doing it.
There are certain things that do differ a lot, and along with the Industrial Revolution, we see the concept of globalization. Along with the globalization, there was a lot of some anthropologists claim a huge decline on culture, in the sense that a lot of the cultural marks have been kind of declined. It says there's a couple of studies that say that within the next couple of years we are going to see a lot of dead languages. Ever since the globalization entailed, there is a lot of different languages, communities that's gone into the decline because they cannot keep up with a global scheme at all. You can also see that on how migrations kind of tend to happen, how certain places are more prone to developments, how certain places are more prone to gather people around, like this almost romanticization of where you can go to get work, to kind of develop yourself academically, professionally, and whatnot.
Right.
That kind of kills a bit of society, of the diversity of society. I think AI in itself will also kill a lot of society in that sense. It will kind of standardize practices.
I agree.
Because as making things so much more effective, we're looking into things that are effective but not necessarily entailed with culture. You can see that a lot with art. Art is a phenomenon. I don't think you can explain art in the sense of something that's particularly grand or something that's particularly beautiful. Aesthetics is the least thing that has to do with it. Compare modern day art with Renaissance art. Both of them are equally as good, but focuses culturally are very different, and they entail different emblems of meaning. In itself is not how fine a piece of art is, but just how it entails, how it's embedded with some cultural dimensions. And the cultural dimensions that have been built upon the globalization aspects are very individualized to that extent. The concept of individualization is a very difficult concept, but
Absolutely.
it is essentially how some authors like Marx claim it's alienation, some authors like Nietzsche claiming that's individualization, so does Foucault, so does Chomsky. It's a process in which the individual kind of standardizes itself within a cultural mold, but doesn't seek to belong to a cultural dimension of society overall.
Mm.
That's why we have these ever-going problems of loneliness, of depression and whatnot, because the individual itself doesn't get to enjoy that cultural landmark of interaction, but rather more on the association of associating with other individuals. You look into really deeply within language, you can see that most of the leading countries like the United States or some European countries, their language are more entailed with highly individualized practices, highly close practices that focus more on the individual itself, and that's in itself very alienating.
Absolutely.
While you see more of the not leading countries, their language is more based on community practice or on more focused on the we rather than the I.
We were talking a little bit about like how AI and machine learning can help us perform tasks faster, more efficiently. How do you feel about artists losing their originality and that sense of culture that comes from art that people can generate from AI, from generative AI? Like, let's say that thing we were talking about a few weeks back with Gemini, right? All that stuff with product design, how efficient we can do things with machine learning, deep machine learning, and AI. How do you feel about artists who are going to be using generative AI for their creative process? How do you feel about them? How are the hopes for maintaining one's originality through the use of generative AI?
I think originality, creativity is a grand illusion artists kind of built on themselves to believe there's something special. There's nothing inherently special about an artist itself. And that may sound very rough, but a lot of how art develops is a matter of construction of chances and whatnot.
No, yeah.
And I'll make a quick parallel. And this is some study done in some college back in Chicago a couple of years ago. And they compare how most huge breakthroughs in science and whatnot are pretty much incidental. It doesn't relate to how brilliant a researcher, a professor, or someone is at making something, but it rather has more to do relate on the conditions of the cultural environment. And you can see a very interesting example on the invention of the fridge. The fridge was invented in two different times, in two different
Oh, right.
places
I heard
at
about
the same
this.
time.
And two people had they had it patented, and then they fought over it.
Yeah.
Right.
They created the exact same process of a fridge, but neither of them had knowledge of each other.
Right.
One of them was here in the States.
Then one was in Europe, too.
One of he was here in the States. He was making the fridge because there was a huge issue with fevers. So he wanted to create a system that would kind of cool down places. So he came up with a system. And at the same time, someone in Europe did it. And neither of them had knowledge that each of them were working on the same projects. There were some previous background information, some previous breakthroughs that kind of allowed them to come up with the same idea at the exact same period of time. So is the extent of artistry. Artistry is an incidental conclusion of how culture develops. Artists in itself are just also byproducts of what culture entails them and allows them to create to some extent. Some of the best artists in that sense kind of built upon that notion of culture. So that notion of originality of someone it was said a lot during the Renaissance that someone was divinely embedded with creativity to create something that was almost godlike. That's beside the point. Art itself is just an extension of language, an extension of meaning.
Right. I agree. I feel like, my personal opinion on like art and artists is that we are sort of like conduits. So that's why I kind of freaked out when you said like some sort of divine connection, right? Because there is all this energy in the universe and we are conduits of that energy. So in my opinion, really, I feel like it's about how you use the tool, how you use the AI. And so long as you make it an ethical tool that one can use and not feel like they are excluded, or making sure that one doesn't feel like they have any limitations with what they can create with generative AI. If they learn how to use that tool, they can reach for the stars. That I feel like that's totally the direction we're heading into right now.
I completely agree, but that's precisely the problem. The problem relies entirely on culture, relies on entirely on comeuppance, it relies entirely on how people get to be institutionalized. They get how people are learn to live in community, and the general problem, the general consensus you can see with AI, with all these kind of tools, is how a standardized society gets to be. That's why I was talking about the concept of globalization, how we have this general loss of culture, this general loss of languages. Languages are very important because in itself, language as a unit is not only a thing that kind of relates to the world. It's not that when I say the word book, it just means physical. It's just a reflection of a physical thing. It has a complete cultural dimension. If you attempt to translate different things, they don't you cannot translate and expect the meaning to be equally the same in different languages. I'll give you a very interesting example. Let's compare English with Navajo, for instance. In English, when you want to say that you are riding a horse, you say, I ride the horse, right? It has this connotation that you're making the horse do something. It's your own action that you're putting into the horse. If the exact same expression in Navajo is very literally translated as the horse is walking for me. It entails that it's a willing action of the horse. It has less to do with you and more of a service that the horse is producing to you. There's a whole cultural dimension embedded in it. There's a whole different view of identity deep-rooted in language. And that kind of identity, that kind of message communication is what entails and makes art special. The whole thing with AI, it will give you the capacity to do anything, but also as a hummingbird effect, as a byproduct of that, on how this general tendency of technology is going about. Even if you have the capacity to do anything, doesn't mean that there are going to be brilliant people that are going to get to do anything, just because the way culture is leading into won't give you the tools within yourself to come up with anything. And that's where the grand illusion of okay, so we just gotta become smarter, we just gotta become better. The completely creative people that have the potential to come up with these grand ideas, that's beyond the point, because you cannot get ideas unless you somewhat learn to create ideas, and how this very institutionalized, very globalized version of society doesn't allow for that, as it kills a lot of variety, a lot of culture.
Exactly, and that's why communication is key. Like, that's why you need to learn how to communicate with these tools, is that so you can use them to the best of your ability across language barriers as well. There's 11 Labs that was working on communication between language barriers that I did in that workshop. That's something that's definitely going to be a useful tool for communication in general.
So there is this very peculiar symptom I come to believe about AI as a whole, and that AI is a very natural tool for a panopticon style disciplinary system. And this is not entirely a new idea. This comes from Foucault's theory, and Foucault's theory is very descriptive of Western society after the Industrial Revolution. But I think AI kind of propels this to an ultimate stage, if you want to call it that. So let's talk about some context about what a panopticon even is. It stems from an architectural principle that was used to build a lot of the prison systems. Panopticon is a tower that's kind of placed in the middle. It's a watchtower to kind of have surveillance on the inmates. And how it works is that it's built upon window panes, so it can look at every instance of the prison, but out of some light techniques, inmates cannot look what's inside the tower. There's a certain glare that doesn't allow inmates to know what's happening. So they are on the constant notion that they're being watched, but they cannot know whether they're being watched at that very instance. And out of some psychological studies, they have found that our behavior changes quite drastically whether we're being watched or whether we're completely alone. And I think we all behave that to some extent. Like we're not the same when we're on our own with a certain group of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we are social creatures. We're socialized to behave a certain way depending on the circumstances. Out of that principle, Foucault in the 20th century explained that it can be used more not only in the penitentiary system, but it can extend to various instances of society. And there is a very pretty example on how the educational system works in general. When you're seated in a classroom, you have your panopticon, the professor, the teacher, whatever, a single unit that's at the very front of the classroom that gets to watch all the classroom at the same time. And whether the professor is watching you directly or not, you're still at the constant state of, oh, I'm being surveyed, and I have to behave a certain way that is adequate for the teaching environment. Not only that, but a huge important part of the panopticon theory is that of individualization and categorization. Each student is individualized within their own cell. Their desk, they're not in a group, but they're just individually rooted in throughout the classroom.
Right.
And then you're categorized, and you get a different treatment depending on how you're categorized. You might be the smart kid, you might be the troublemaker, you might be the one that skips class and whatnot. That kind of creates a certain expectation of how you're going to be socialized. The thing is that the panopticon is not only a matter of, okay, I can survey people and understand them, but it has been proven that it can actually alter behavior quite drastically. And if you implement it properly, you can get people to behave a certain way you want. That's how the whole education system works. That's how a lot of societies are different, for instance, because they are socialized to be different, to entail a different cultural dimension. That's why you cannot, a 10-year-old from the United States is not going to be a 10-year-old from Europe or a 10-year-old from China. They're all going to be different because of the way they're socialized. We extend this to the AI. AI, in its principle, is very individualized in the sense that it learns from you. It adapts to you. Take, for instance, the Instagram or YouTube algorithm. They learn your behavior, and they kind of produce, they kind of push content that's more tailored towards you.
Exactly.
And it kind of vacuum seals you into your own delusion, to your own mind. And how this works is that once you have individualized the individual into one single unit, it's very easy to categorize it. Even if you think you're completely unique, you're not your own self to that extent. You're the byproduct of cultural encounters, of chances, of experiences. And to a certain extent, every single individual can be categorized into a certain expectation. You're individualized and categorized, and once you're categorized, if implemented properly, you can be disciplined to a certain set of behaviors. That's how the whole point of a panopticon was built on, that you can not only survey the complete activity of individuals, but once you know the individuals, you can kind of tailor an education system or a disciplinary system that will adapt to very procedural results. You can see this in education when you say that not every kid is going to benefit or learn the same way. So once you figure out what's the best teaching approach towards an individual, you can actually get them to do what you want. And a panopticon in that sense can do that very easily. It can study you very rapidly. It can individualize you very easily. In how an AI's neural network works, it can categorize you just as equally. The only thing that's essentially missing is that disciplinary aspect that's completely tailored from a like it almost seems like it comes straight up from a dystopia or whatnot.
Yeah, I was gonna say it does sound very scary almost. Like it knowing you, AI getting to the point where it knows exactly what you want.
And
That sounds scary.
And to a certain extent, AI already does so. Take, for example, Anthropic's constitutional AI, in the sense that currently is being used to kind of push certain harmful biases away from the kind of answers the AI can give. But if you just up it a little more, it'll give you answers and it'll give you results that are very purposefully driven to push a certain type of narrative, to push a certain cultural model. And that way, an AI, if completely massified, if completely rooted into our cultural dimensions, will feed up on further standardizing society. Not only further standardizing society, but perhaps creating a super disciplinary machine to almost 1984's notion of controlling society down to its very core.
Yeah, sounds really scary. Sounds very dystopian, very uncomfortable almost.
Sounds like a bestseller novel.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a space odyssey, like. But unfortunately, we do need to wrap this up. So, thank you so much for talking to me and giving me your time and your opinions. And thank y'all for coming out here. And I will see you next time.